Later, she had driven herself to a quiet restaurant and ordered a single glass of wine, toasting her achievement in solitude while her phone remained silent. The photograph she had taken of herself in her cap and gown, holding her diploma, had received exactly 3 likes on social media. Melody's post about her company retreat that same day had received over 200. The pattern had been established years earlier, during their childhood in the suburbs of Atlanta. Celeste had been the quiet, studious daughter, the one who spent her afternoons in the library and her weekends volunteering at the local animal shelter. Melody had been the social butterfly, the one who excelled at everything that mattered to their parents: cheerleading, student government, and dating the captain of the football team. When Celeste had won the state science fair with a project on emergency medical techniques, the victory had been overshadowed by Melody's selection as homecoming queen the same week. Their parents had filled their social media with photos from the homecoming dance, while Celeste's trophy had found its way to a dusty shelf in the basement. But it was during their father's heart attack 3 years ago that the family dynamics had revealed themselves most clearly. Celeste had been completing her residency at the time, working brutal hours in the emergency department of a level 1 trauma center. When the call had come at 2 in the morning, she had immediately driven the 4 hours home, arriving at the hospital still in her scrubs from her own shift. She had spent the next 72 hours coordinating her father's care, using her medical knowledge to communicate with his doctors, ensuring he received the best possible treatment, and sleeping in uncomfortable waiting room chairs while monitoring his progress. Melody had arrived the following afternoon, having taken time to pack appropriately and arrange coverage at work. She had swept into the hospital wearing a designer outfit suitable for a medical crisis, carrying flowers and a gift basket from the expensive market downtown. Within hours, she had charmed the nursing staff, organized a meal train for their mother, and posted regular updates on social media about her father's condition, painting herself as the devoted daughter who was holding the family together during their time of crisis. When their father had been discharged a week later, their mother had tearfully thanked Melody for being such a rock during the difficult time. The fact that Celeste had essentially served as his unofficial case manager, had caught a medication error that could have been dangerous, and had negotiated with the insurance company to ensure his procedures were covered had somehow become invisible in the narrative. Melody's flowers and frequent social media updates had been more visible, more emotionally satisfying to their parents than Celeste's quiet professional competence. The injustice of it had been suffocating, but it had also been clarifying. That week in the hospital had shown Celeste that her family's love came with conditions she could never meet. They valued performance over substance, visibility over effectiveness, charm over competence. She could save their father's life, but if she couldn't do it with the right kind of flourish, it wouldn't count. It was shortly after her father's recovery that Celeste had made the decision that would change everything. She had been walking through the hospital corridors late one evening, tired from another 18-hour shift, when she had encountered a military recruiter visiting a wounded soldier. The conversation she overheard had been about service, about using medical skills to save lives in circumstances where every decision mattered, where competence was the only currency that counted. The idea had taken root immediately. The Army Medical Corps had offered her something her family never could, a place where her skills were valued for what they accomplished rather than how they appeared to others. Her first deployment had been to a field hospital in Afghanistan, where she had learned to perform surgery under conditions that would have been unimaginable in civilian practice. She had operated by generator power during sandstorms, had saved the lives of soldiers whose injuries were beyond anything she had seen in textbook photographs, had made split-second decisions that meant the difference between someone going home to their family or going home in a flag-draped coffin. The work had been brutal, terrifying, and absolutely transformative. Every successful surgery, every life saved, every moment when her steady hands and quick thinking had pulled someone back from the edge of death had built something inside her that no amount of family criticism could tear down. She had found her calling in those operating rooms half a world away from home, surrounded by people who valued her for exactly the qualities her family had always dismissed as insufficient. During her second deployment, she had developed a new technique for treating traumatic brain injuries in field conditions, a protocol that had been adopted throughout the military medical system and had saved hundreds of lives. The innovation had earned her recognition from the highest levels of military leadership, but she had never mentioned it to her family. They wouldn't have understood its significance anyway, and she had grown tired of watching their eyes glaze over when she tried to explain work that didn't fit into their narrow definition of success. The contradiction of her existence had become almost absurd. While Melody built her reputation managing corporate consulting projects, Celeste was quietly saving lives in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. While Melody worried about client retention and quarterly performance reviews, Celeste was performing surgery during mortar attacks and developing medical protocols that were being implemented across 3 different branches of the military. While Melody's greatest challenge was navigating office politics, Celeste was navigating actual war zones, earning the respect of generals and the gratitude of soldiers whose names she would never know. But the most profound transformation had been internal. The woman who had once desperately sought her family's approval had been replaced by someone who had found her worth in the work itself, in the knowledge that her skills and dedication were making a difference in ways that mattered far beyond any dinner table conversation or family gathering. She had learned to measure her success not by her family's reaction to it, but by the lives she had saved, the innovations she had contributed to military medicine, and the respect she had earned from colleagues who understood the weight of life and death decisions. Standing in the Sterling and Associates Christmas party, watching Melody hold court among people who were impressed by her corporate achievements, Celeste felt a profound sense of peace about the divergent paths their lives had taken. She no longer needed their validation, no longer craved their approval, no longer felt diminished by their inability to see her clearly. She had found her own measures of worth, and they were unshakable. Tonight, that strength would be tested in ways she couldn't yet imagine. Tonight, the carefully constructed walls between her 2 worlds were about to crashing down, and the family that had spent years making her feel invisible was about to discover just how visible she had become to people who truly mattered. Melody spotted Celeste near the entrance and glided over with the practiced smile she reserved for networking events, her champagne flute held at the perfect angle to catch the light from the chandeliers. She air-kissed Celeste's cheek with the kind of affection that looked genuine from a distance but felt hollow up close, then immediately stepped back to assess her sister's appearance with barely concealed disappointment. The borrowed black dress, the simple pearl earrings, the understated makeup, all of it fell short of Melody's standards for what someone should wear to an event of this caliber. "You made it," Melody said, her voice carrying just enough warmth to sound welcoming, while her eyes conveyed a different message entirely.
"I know how demanding those little community health jobs can be." The way she emphasized little made it clear that she considered Celeste's work to be exactly that, a small, insignificant way to pass time until something better came along. Before Celeste could respond, Melody had already turned her attention to the approaching figure of Harold Sterling himself, the founding partner of the firm and the man whose approval could make or break careers within the company. He was exactly what Celeste had expected from Melody's descriptions: silver-haired, expensively dressed with the kind of commanding presence that came from decades of wielding influence in corporate boardrooms. Behind him walked a man Celeste recognized, but hoped desperately that Melody would not: General Robert Crawford, whose presence at a consulting firm's Christmas party seemed unusual until Celeste remembered that Sterling and Associates had recently landed a major government contract. "Mr. Sterling," Melody's voice took on the honey-sweet tone she used when she wanted to make an impression. "I'd love you to meet my older sister, Celeste. She's visiting from out of town." The introduction was carefully crafted to minimize Celeste's importance while still appearing generous, a masterful example of the social manipulation that Melody had perfected over the years. Sterling extended his hand with polite interest, the kind of attention he might give to any employee's visiting relative. while General Crawford stood slightly behind him, his sharp eyes taking in the interaction with the analytical gaze of someone accustomed to reading situations quickly and accurately. Celeste shook Sterling's hand, noting the firm grip and the way his attention was already starting to drift toward more important conversations elsewhere in the room. "What line of work are you in, Celeste?" Sterling asked, the question delivered with the kind of polite disinterest that suggested he was already formulating his exit strategy from this particular conversation. Before Celeste could answer, Melody jumped in with the verbal equivalent of a pat on the head, her laugh tinkling like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "Oh, Celeste works at one of those little veterans clinics. Taking care of routine checkups and paperwork. Nothing too exciting, but she seems to enjoy helping people with their basic medical needs." The dismissal was complete and devastating, reducing years of medical training and life-saving work to the equivalent of filing insurance forms and checking blood pressure. The words hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle, acrid and lingering. Celeste felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the old reflexive urge to shrink, to accept the diminishment, to smile politely and change the subject. But something had shifted in the months since her last deployment, something fundamental about how she saw herself and her place in the world. The woman who had operated on wounded soldiers under enemy fire, who had earned the respect of commanders and the gratitude of countless families, was no longer willing to be reduced to a footnote in someone else's story. "Actually," Celeste said, her voice calm and clear, "I practice emergency medicine and trauma surgery." The correction was simple and factual, delivered without defensiveness or aggression, but it landed with enough force to make Sterling's eyebrows rise slightly and cause Melody's smile to flicker around the edges. Melody's recovery was swift and brutal, her laugh becoming sharper, more dismissive. "Well, that makes it sound much more impressive than it really is," she said, her voice carrying the kind of condescending affection that family members could use as a weapon. "I mean, it's not like she's saving lives or anything dramatic. It's really just a little neighborhood clinic that treats minor injuries and does routine care for veterans. Nothing like real emergency medicine at a major hospital." The cruelty of the moment was breathtaking in its casual completeness. Melody had not only dismissed Celeste's work, but had done so in front of her boss and his client, reducing her sister to the level of a well-meaning amateur playing at being a doctor. It was character assassination delivered with a smile, public humiliation wrapped in the guise of sisterly teasing. But as Melody delivered her final crushing blow, General Crawford stepped forward, his movement deliberate and commanding. The change in his posture was subtle but unmistakable, the shift from casual observer to active participant that anyone with military experience would recognize immediately. His eyes, which had been politely interested moments before, now held the sharp focus of someone who had heard something that demanded correction. "Excuse me," General Crawford said, his voice cutting through Melody's lingering laughter with the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. "Did you say your sister's name was Celeste?" His gaze fixed on Celeste with an intensity that made the air in the room feel suddenly charged with electricity. Melody nodded, still smiling, but beginning to sense that something had shifted in the dynamic of the conversation, though she couldn't yet identify what or why. "Yes, Celeste Whitmore. She's my older sister. Like I said, she works at a little clinic somewhere." General Crawford's expression transformed completely, his casual party demeanor replaced by something approaching awe. He straightened to his full height, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of someone delivering information of the utmost importance. "Mr. Sterling," he said, never taking his eyes off Celeste, "I don't think you understand who you're talking to." The general's words created a pocket of absolute silence in the immediate vicinity, causing nearby conversations to falter as people sensed the gravity of whatever was unfolding. Sterling's polite disinterest evaporated, replaced by sharp attention as he recognized the seriousness in his client's voice. Melody's smile began to fade, confusion creeping into her expression as she tried to understand why the general was looking at her sister as if she were someone of tremendous importance. "This is Major General Hayes. one of the most decorated battlefield surgeons in the United States military. She developed the trauma protocols that have saved hundreds of lives in combat zones. She's operated under enemy fire in 3 different countries and earned more commendations for valor than most career officers see in a lifetime.
The words hit the small group like a physical force, creating a ripple effect that spread outward through the immediate area as people stopped their own conversations to listen. Sterling's mouth opened slightly, his businessman's composure cracking as he processed the magnitude of his error in judgment. Melody's champagne flute trembled in her hand, her face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and the dawning horror of complete social miscalculation. "But that's impossible," Melody whispered, her voice barely audible above the ambient noise of the party. "She works at a clinic. She drives an old Honda. She lives in a tiny apartment." The words tumbled out as if saying them could somehow make them more true than the reality that was crashing down around her carefully constructed worldview. General Crawford's expression softened slightly as he looked at Melody, but his voice remained firm. Major General Hayes maintains a civilian medical practice as part of her cover for active classified operations. Her official rank and her service record are among the most impressive I've ever encountered. The Army doesn't advertise the identities of officers involved in sensitive missions, but I can tell you that this woman has saved more lives and served her country with more distinction than most people could imagine. The revelation continued to spread through the party like ripples in a pond, conversations stopping as people turned to look at the quiet woman in the simple black dress who had just been revealed to be one of the most accomplished military officers in the room. Celeste stood at the center of the growing attention, her posture straight and dignified. No longer the dismissed sister, but revealed as exactly who she had always been, a warrior and a healer whose true worth had simply been invisible to people incapable of seeing beyond their own limited understanding of what mattered. Stefan stepped forward, his hand extended again, but this time his grip was firm and his attention complete. "Major General Hayes, it is an absolute honor to meet you. I had no idea we had someone of your caliber at our party tonight." His voice carried the respect of someone who understood that he was in the presence of genuine greatness, the kind that came not from corporate achievement, but from service to something larger than oneself. Melody stood frozen, her champagne flute forgotten in her hand, watching as her sister transformed before her eyes, from the disappointing family member she had always known into someone she couldn't recognize, someone whose accomplishments dwarfed everything Melody had ever achieved. The woman she had just dismissed as a nobody was being treated with the kind of reverence usually reserved for heads of state, and the contrast between her assumptions and reality was so stark it left her speechless. The moment stretched on, pregnant with the weight of years of misunderstanding and dismissal, until Celeste finally spoke, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had earned the right to be heard. "Thank you for your kind words, General Crawford. It's been an honor to serve." She turned to Sterling with a slight smile. "And thank you, Mr. Sterling. I hope you'll understand that my work requires a certain level of discretion." As the initial shock began to wear off and normal conversations slowly resumed around them, Melody found herself face to face with the sister she thought she knew, but who had just been revealed as a complete stranger, someone whose life was so far beyond Melody's understanding that she couldn't even begin to process the implications of what she had just learned. The silence that followed General Crawford's revelation stretched like a taut wire about to snap. Melody felt as though the ground beneath her expensive heels had suddenly become quicksand, shifting and unreliable, threatening to swallow her whole. She stared at Celeste, searching for some sign that this was all an elaborate mistake, that her quiet, unremarkable sister couldn't possibly be the decorated military officer the general was describing with such obvious reverence. But as Melody looked closer, she began to see things she had never noticed before, or perhaps had chosen not to see. The way Celeste carried herself with a subtle confidence that had nothing to do with designer clothes or social status. The calmness in her eyes, the kind that came from facing genuine life and death situations rather than quarterly performance reviews. The steady hands that Melody had always assumed were just naturally graceful, now revealed as instruments trained to save lives under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. Around them, the party continued, but with a different energy,
Word of Celeste's true identity was spreading through the room like wildfire, and people who had been content to ignore the quiet woman in the simple black dress were now finding reasons to drift closer, hoping to catch a glimpse of someone who had operated under enemy fire, who had earned medals for valor that most people only read about in history books. Harold Sterling had smoothly transitioned into full host mode, his businessman's instincts recognizing that he had stumbled upon something rare and valuable. Major General Hayes, I insist you allow me to introduce you to some of our other guests. We have several clients here tonight who would be deeply honored to meet you. His voice carried the enthusiasm of someone who had just discovered a hidden treasure at what he had assumed was an ordinary social gathering. General Crawford nodded approvingly at Sterling's suggestion, then turned back to Celeste with the kind of professional respect that was unmistakable to anyone watching. I've been following your work on the new trauma protocols, Major General Hayes. The innovations you developed during your deployment in Syria have revolutionized how we approach battlefield medicine. I'd love to discuss them further with you if you have time this evening. Celeste's response was gracious but measured, the practiced diplomacy of someone accustomed to navigating delicate situations. I'd be happy to discuss the medical aspects that aren't classified, General Hayes, though I should mention that much of the development work was truly a team effort. The conditions in the field have a way of inspiring innovation out of necessity. As the conversation continued around her, Melody felt increasingly invisible, a sensation that was both foreign and deeply unsettling. She was accustomed to being the center of attention at these events, the one whose opinions mattered, whose connections opened doors, whose presence added value to any gathering. Now, she stood on the periphery, watching as her sister commanded the kind of genuine respect that no amount of networking or corporate achievement could manufacture.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The most disturbing part wasn't just that Celeste had been hiding this enormous aspect of her life, but that Melody had been so completely blind to it. She thought back to their phone conversations over the years, trying to remember if there had been clues she had missed, signs that her sister's life was far more complex and significant than it appeared on the surface. But she realized with growing horror that she had never really listened to Celeste talk about her work, had never asked meaningful questions about her deployments or her medical training, had never shown any curiosity about the parts of her sister's life that didn't fit into Melody's narrow understanding of what constituted success. The memory that surfaced was particularly painful. 2 years ago, Celeste had called to say she would miss their mother's birthday dinner because she had been called away suddenly for what she had described as a medical emergency. Melody had rolled her eyes and complained to their parents about Celeste's inability to prioritize family obligations, suggesting that her sister was probably just making excuses to avoid social situations. Now, understanding that these sudden departures were likely classified military missions, Melody felt thick with shame at her own callousness and ignorance. Another memory followed, equally devastating. Last Christmas, when Celeste had seemed distracted and tired during their family gathering, Melody had made several cutting remarks about her sister's apparent lack of enthusiasm for the holiday festivities. She had suggested that Celeste seemed depressed and might benefit from therapy or medication to help her engage more fully with life. The cruel irony was now obvious. Celeste had probably just returned from saving lives in some war-torn corner of the world, dealing with trauma and stress that Melody couldn't even imagine. And instead of support or understanding, she had received criticism for not being cheerful enough at a family dinner. As these realizations crashed over her like successive waves, Melody felt her carefully constructed self-image beginning to crumble. She had built her identity around being the successful sister, the one who had figured out how the world worked, who had achieved recognition and status through her own efforts. But standing here, watching Celeste interact with genuine heroes and leaders, Melody was forced to confront the possibility that her definition of success had been embarrassingly shallow. The conversation around them had evolved into a broader discussion about military medicine and the challenges of providing care in combat zones. Several other guests had joined the group, drawn by the opportunity to speak with someone who had actual experience in these areas. Melody listened as Celeste spoke with quiet authority about surgical techniques, about the psychological challenges of treating wounded soldiers, about the innovations that had emerged from the desperate need to save lives with limited resources. What struck Melody most profoundly was how different Celeste seemed in this context. Bon was the diffident younger sister who had always seemed slightly apologetic for her existence. In her place was a woman of obvious competence and authority, someone whose opinions carried weight because they were grounded in real experience, rather than theoretical knowledge. This was Celeste as she truly was, not the diminished version that existed in Melody's perception, but the accomplished professional that the rest of the world knew her to be. The transformation was so complete that Melody began to wonder if she had ever really known her sister at all. Every interaction they had ever had would need to be re-examined through this new lens. Every assumption she had made about Celeste's life and choices would need to be reevaluated. The quiet woman she had dismissed as unsuccessful was actually one of the most accomplished people in the room, someone whose work had tangible, life-saving impact on a global scale. As the evening progressed, Melody found herself relegated to the role of observer, watching as person after person approached Celeste with obvious respect and genuine interest in her work. These were not the shallow networking interactions that Melody was accustomed to, where people phased each other up based on job titles and earning potential. These conversations had substance and depth, grounded in mutual respect for someone who had dedicated her life to service rather than personal gain. The contrast between how people responded to Celeste versus how they typically responded to Melody was stark and humbling. While Melody had spent years cultivating relationships based on what she could offer professionally, Celeste commanded respect simply by being who she was, by having done work that mattered in ways that transcended corporate hierarchies and social status. When General Crawford mentioned that Celeste had been recommended for another major commendation, one that couldn't be publicly announced due to the classified nature of her recent work, Melody felt the final pieces of her worldview shifting into their new, uncomfortable positions. Her sister wasn't just successful by different standards than Melody had understood. She was successful by any conceivable standard, operating at levels of responsibility and achievement that made Melody's corporate accomplishments seem trivial by comparison. The most painful realization was how completely she had failed as a sister. While Celeste had been risking her life to save others, Melody had been concerned with her own image and reputation. While Celeste had been earning genuine respect through service and sacrifice, Melody had been pursuing superficial status symbols. And worst of all, while Celeste had been quietly changing the world through her medical innovations and battlefield heroism, Melody had been treating her like a disappointment, someone whose life needed improvement and whose choices needed correcting. Standing there in her designer dress, surrounded by the trappings of corporate success, Melody had never felt smaller or more insignificant. The sister she had spent years pitying and condescending to had been living a life of genuine heroism, while Melody had been playing elaborate games of social positioning that suddenly seemed petty and meaningless in comparison. The crystal chandeliers continued to cast their warm glow over the Sterling and Associates Christmas party, but for Melody, the light felt harsh and exposing now, illuminating truths she had spent years avoiding. As she watched another group of distinguished guests approach Celeste, with their faces bright with the genuine enthusiasm reserved for meeting someone whose reputation preceded them, among them was Senator Patricia Wells, whose husband had served in Afghanistan and who immediately began thanking Celeste for the innovations that had saved her husband's unit during a particularly brutal engagement. Melody felt like she was watching a movie about someone else's life, someone who happened to share her sister's face, but was otherwise completely foreign to her understanding. The Celeste being celebrated in this room bore no resemblance to the struggling younger sister Melody had constructed in her mind, the one who needed guidance and correction, who had somehow failed to launch properly into adult success. This Celeste moved through conversations with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to being consulted on matters of life and death, someone whose opinions carried weight in rooms where decisions affected thousands of lives. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming.
Melody had built her entire adult identity around being the successful sister, the one who had figured out how the world worked, who had achieved recognition and status through her own efforts. But standing here watching Celeste interact with genuine heroes and leaders, Melody was forced to confront the possibility that her definition of success had been embarrassingly shallow. The conversation around them had evolved into a broader discussion about military medicine and the challenges of providing care in combat zones. Several other guests had joined the group, drawn by the opportunity to speak with someone who had actual experience in these areas.
He spoke about trauma protocols that had reduced battlefield mortality rates, about surgical techniques that have been adapted for use in civilian emergency rooms, about the ripple effects of innovation that began in combat zones and ultimately saved lives around the world. Major General Hayes developed a new approach to treating traumatic brain injuries that has been adopted throughout the military medical system, General Crawford was saying, his voice carrying the authority of someone who understood the technical complexities he was describing. Her work has been directly responsible for saving hundreds of lives, and the techniques she pioneered are now being taught in medical schools across the country. Melody listened to these words as if she were hearing a foreign language. Traumatic brain injuries, military medical system, hundreds of lives saved. These phrases described a world of responsibility and impact that existed on a completely different scale from anything in Melody's experience. The biggest crisis in her professional life had been losing a major client, an event that had kept her awake for weeks and had required months of reputation management to overcome. But even that seemed trivial compared to the casual mention of hundreds of lives saved, of innovations that were changing how medicine was practiced around the world. As she continued to listen, more details emerged about Celeste's work that painted an increasingly stark picture of just how thoroughly Melody had misunderstood her sister's life. There were mentions of deployments to multiple combat zones, of surgical procedures performed under conditions that sounded like something from a war movie, of commendations and awards that represented recognition from the highest levels of military and government leadership. Each new piece of information felt like another blow to Melody's carefully constructed worldview. The most devastating revelation came when Senator Wells mentioned that her husband had specifically requested to meet Celeste because the trauma protocol she had developed had been used to save the life of his unit's medic during an ambush outside Kandahar. The senator's voice was thick with emotion as she described how that medic had gone on to save dozens of other lives during the remainder of his deployment, creating a cascade of life-saving impact that could be traced back to Celeste's innovations. "Your sister literally changed the trajectory of my husband's entire unit," Senator Wells was saying to Melody, her hand resting gently on Melody's arm. "The techniques she developed kept their medic alive, and he went on to save so many others. It's one of those butterfly effect situations where a single innovation creates ripples that spread far beyond what anyone could have imagined." Melody nodded and smiled, trying to appear gracious, while internally reeling from the implications of what she was hearing. The quiet sister she had dismissed as unsuccessful had created innovations that were saving lives on a scale Melody couldn't even conceptualize. While Melody had been concerned with client retention and profit margins, Celeste had been developing techniques that were keeping soldiers alive, that were changing how medicine was practiced, that were having measurable impact on human suffering around the world. The contrast was so stark, it was almost incomprehensible. Melody's greatest professional achievement had been landing a major government contract that generated significant revenue for Sterling and Associates. It was work she was genuinely proud of, requiring months of preparation and strategic thinking. But even that paled in comparison to developing medical techniques that were saving hundreds of lives. The scale of impact was so different that it made Melody's accomplishments feel almost insignificant by comparison. As the evening progressed, Melody found herself relegated to an increasingly peripheral role in conversations that had originally been meant to showcase her social connections and professional status.
People who had initially approached the group to speak with her were now entirely focused on Celeste, asking detailed questions about military medicine, about her deployments, about the challenges of providing medical care in combat zones. These weren't the superficial networking conversations that Melody was accustomed to. They had substance and depth, grounded in genuine respect for someone who had dedicated her life to something larger than personal advancement. The transformation in how people treated Celeste versus how they treated Melody was subtle but unmistakable. While conversations with Melody typically focused on transactional topics, business opportunities, mutual connections that could be leveraged for professional advantage, the discussions surrounding Celeste had an entirely different quality. People weren't trying to network with her or extract value from the relationship. They were simply honored to be in the presence of someone whose work they respected, someone who had made genuine contributions to something that mattered beyond quarterly profit reports. When Harold Sterling returned to our group after circulating through the party, his entire demeanor toward Celeste had shifted from polite interest to something approaching reverence. Major General Hayes, I've been speaking with several of our clients this evening, and I have to tell you that your presence here tonight has elevated this entire event. We have defense contractors, former military officers, government officials, all of whom have expressed genuine excitement about meeting you. He paused, clearly choosing his words carefully. I hope this doesn't seem presumptuous, but several people have asked if you might consider speaking at some of our future events. Not about anything classified, of course, but perhaps about leadership under pressure, about innovation in crisis situations, about the kind of decision-making skills that military medical work requires. I think there would be tremendous interest in hearing your perspective on these topics. Celeste's response was gracious but measured, the practiced diplomacy of someone accustomed to navigating requests for her time and expertise. That's very kind of you to offer, Mr. Sterling. I'd be happy to consider it, though my schedule can be somewhat unpredictable due to the nature of my work. The casual mention of her unpredictable schedule was another reminder of the classified aspects of Celeste's work, the deployments and operations that Melody had never even known existed. She thought back to all the times Celeste had been unavailable for family events, all the occasions when she had seemed distracted or tired during their interactions. She had interpreted these as signs of Celeste's social awkwardness or her inability to prioritize family relationships properly. Now she understood that her sister had been managing the psychological and physical demands of work that most people couldn't even imagine. The memory that surfaced was particularly painful. 3 months ago, their cousin had gotten married, and Celeste had attended the reception but left early, claiming she wasn't feeling well. Melody had made several cutting remarks to other family members about Celeste's antisocial tendencies, suggesting that her sister had probably just made up an excuse to avoid the social demands of a large family gathering.
Now, Melody wondered if Celeste had just returned from a deployment, if she had been dealing with the kind of trauma and stress that would make a wedding reception feel overwhelming and surreal. Another memory followed, equally devastating in its implications. Last summer, when their grandmother had been hospitalized with pneumonia, behind the scenes, using her expertise to ensure their grandmother received the best possible care while maintaining appropriate boundaries about her professional qualifications. These realizations were accumulating like stones in Melody's chest, each one adding weight to a growing sense of shame about how thoroughly she had misunderstood and misjudged her sister. Every interaction they had ever had would need to be re-examined through this new lens. Every assumption she had made about Celeste's choices and priorities would need to be completely reevaluated. The conversation around them had shifted to a discussion about the challenges of transitioning from military to civilian medical practice, with several guests asking Celeste about how she managed to maintain her civilian work while fulfilling her military obligations. Her responses revealed yet another layer of complexity to her life that Melody had never suspected. Maintaining 2 separate medical practices, managing the security requirements of classified work, balancing the emotional demands of treating both civilian patients and combat casualties,
all while keeping the different aspects of her professional life carefully compartmentalized. The most challenging part, Celeste was explaining to a retired Air Force colonel, is the psychological transition between environments. In a combat zone, you're making life and death decisions under extreme pressure, often with limited resources and unlimited stakes. Then you come back to a civilian practice where the pace is different, where you have access to advanced equipment and diagnostic tools, but where the emotional intensity is completely different. Learning to navigate between those two worlds requires a certain kind of mental flexibility. Melody listened to this explanation with growing amazement at the complexity of her sister's professional life. She had assumed that Celeste's work was simple and straightforward, routine medical care that didn't require particular skill or dedication. But the reality was far more complicated, involving not just advanced medical expertise, but also the psychological resilience required to operate effectively in multiple high-stress environments. The most disturbing aspect of these revelations wasn't just that Melody had been wrong about Celeste's work, but that she had been so incurious about it. She realized that she had never asked meaningful questions about Celeste's deployments, had never shown interest in the medical techniques she was developing, had never demonstrated any curiosity about the aspects of her sister's life that didn't fit into Melody's narrow understanding of what constituted worthwhile work. When General Crawford mentioned that Celeste had been selected for a fellowship position at the military's premier medical research facility, a position that was offered to only a handful of officers each year, Melody felt another piece of her worldview crumble. This wasn't just about Celeste being more accomplished than Melody had realized. This was about Celeste operating at levels of professional achievement that were beyond anything Melody had ever aspired to reach. The fellowship program, as General Crawford explained it, was designed to bring together the military's most innovative medical minds to work on cutting-edge research that would shape the future of battlefield medicine. Selection for the program was extraordinarily competitive, with applicants evaluated not just on their medical expertise, but also on their research capabilities, their leadership potential, and their ability to translate complex innovations into practical applications that could save lives in real-world situations. Major General Hayes was selected from a pool of over 200 candidates, General Crawford was saying, his voice carrying obvious pride in Celeste's achievement. The selection committee included some of the most distinguished medical minds in the military, and they were unanimous in their assessment that her work represents the future direction of military medical research. Melody tried to process the implications of what she was hearing. 200 candidates? Unanimous selection? The future direction of military medical research? These phrases described achievements that were so far beyond Melody's experience that she struggled to even comprehend their significance. The most competitive situation she had ever faced was interviewing for her current position at Sterling and Associates, a process that had involved perhaps a dozen candidates and had required several months of networking and preparation. But even that comparison felt absurd when placed alongside what Celeste had accomplished. Melody's job interview had been about demonstrating her ability to manage client relationships and develop business strategies. Celeste's selection for this fellowship represented recognition of her ability to innovate at the highest levels of medical science, to develop techniques that would influence how combat medicine was practiced for decades to come. As these realizations continued to accumulate, Melody began to understand that her entire relationship with Celeste had been built on a foundation of fundamental misunderstanding. She had seen herself as the successful sister, the one who had figured out how to navigate the world effectively, who deserved recognition and respect for her achievements. But standing here listening to detailed descriptions of Celeste's work, Melody was forced to confront the possibility that she had been playing in the minor leagues while her sister had been competing at levels Melody hadn't even known existed. The party continued to swirl around them, but Melody felt increasingly disconnected from the conversations and interactions that had once felt so natural and important to her. The networking opportunities that had brought her to this event, the client relationships she had been hoping to develop, the professional connections she had been planning to cultivate, all of it seemed trivial compared to the work Celeste had been doing while Melody was focused on corporate advancement. When someone mentioned that Celeste's trauma protocols had been adopted by civilian emergency rooms and had contributed to improved survival rates for car accident victims and other trauma patients, Melody felt the final pieces of her understanding shift into place. This wasn't just about military medicine or battlefield innovations. Celeste's work was having impact in the civilian world as well, influencing how emergency medicine was practiced in hospitals across the country, improving outcomes for ordinary people who would never know that their survival might be partially attributed to techniques developed in combat zones half a world away. The scope of Celeste's impact was so broad and so profound that it made Melody's professional accomplishments feel almost embarrassingly small by comparison. While Melody was focused on generating revenue for her consulting firm, Celeste had been developing innovations that were literally saving lives on a daily basis. While Melody was concerned with client satisfaction and profit margins, Celeste was working on problems that affected human survival and suffering on a global scale. The conversation around them had evolved into a broader discussion about the intersection of military and civilian medical practice, with several guests asking Celeste about how innovations developed in combat zones could be adapted for use in civilian emergency rooms. Her responses revealed yet another dimension of her expertise, demonstrating not just her medical knowledge, but also her understanding of how to translate complex techniques across different environments and resource contexts. One of the most important lessons from battlefield medicine is the importance of simplicity and adaptability. When you're operating in a combat zone, you don't have access to the full range of diagnostic tools and specialized equipment that you might find in a major medical center. You have to develop techniques that can be effective with basic resources, and that adaptability often leads to innovations that prove valuable even in well-equipped civilian facilities.
This wasn't just about following established medical procedures or applying existing knowledge to routine situations. Celeste was operating at the cutting edge of medical innovation, developing new approaches to complex problems, creating solutions that could be applied across multiple contexts and environments. The most profound realization for Melody was understanding how completely she had failed to see or appreciate this aspect of her sister's life. She had been so focused on her own definition of success, so committed to her own understanding of what constituted meaningful achievement, that she had been blind to accomplishments that dwarfed anything in her own experience. As the evening began to wind down, people started exchanging contact information with Celeste, expressing genuine interest in staying connected with someone whose work they respected and admired. Business cards were offered with obvious enthusiasm. Invitations were extended to speak at various conferences and events. Opportunities were presented for collaboration and consultation. These weren't the superficial networking exchanges that Melody was accustomed to, where people collected contacts for potential future advantage. These were expressions of genuine professional respect and desire for ongoing relationship with someone whose expertise was valued. Watching these interactions, Melody began to understand something fundamental about the difference between her professional relationships and Celeste's. Melody's career had been built on transactional relationships, connections that were valuable primarily for what they could provide in terms of business opportunities and professional advancement. But Celeste's relationships seemed to be grounded in mutual respect for shared commitment to work that mattered, connections based on common purpose rather than mutual utility. The contrast was stark and humbling. While Melody had spent years cultivating relationships that could advance her career, Celeste had earned respect through work that advanced human knowledge and capability. While Melody had focused on building a network that could open doors for her professionally, Celeste had developed expertise that opened doors for innovation and progress in fields that affected human survival and welfare. When General Crawford approached Melody directly for the first time during the evening, his intention was clearly to express appreciation for her family connection to someone he obviously held in high regard. "Ms. Whitmore,
I hope you understand what an extraordinary sister you have. Major General Hayes is truly one of the most accomplished officers I've had the privilege to work with, and her contributions to military medicine have been simply outstanding." Melody's response was automatic and gracious, but internally she was grappling with the irony of being congratulated for her relationship to someone she had spent years trying to help and improve. "Thank you, General Crawford. I'm very proud of Celeste's achievements." The words felt hollow, even as she spoke them, because she was realizing that she had never actually understood what Celeste's achievements were, had never taken the time to learn about the work that was earning this kind of recognition from distinguished military leaders. The general continued, apparently unaware of the complexity of Melody's emotional response to the evening's revelations. She's mentioned that she maintains a civilian practice as well, which speaks to her commitment to serving both military and civilian populations. That kind of dedication to comprehensive medical service is truly admirable. Melody nodded and smiled, but his words were yet another reminder of how superficially she had understood her sister's life. She had seen Celeste's civilian practice as evidence of her inability to commit fully to any particular path, a sign that she was somewhat lost professionally and hadn't found her true calling. Now she understood that maintaining both military and civilian medical practices represented an extraordinary level of commitment and capability, requiring not just advanced medical expertise, but also the organizational skills necessary to manage complex professional obligations across multiple contexts. As the evening continued toward its conclusion, Melody found herself facing a fundamental question about how to move forward with this new understanding of her sister and her own relationship to Celeste's achievements in life. The revelation of Celeste's true professional status had been profound and disturbing, forcing Melody to confront the inadequacy of her own understanding and the limitations of her own achievements. But more than that, it had forced her to confront the possibility that her entire approach to success and achievement had been misguided. While she had been focused on accumulating traditional markers of professional success, Celeste had been engaged in work that had genuine impact on human welfare and survival. While Melody had been concerned with image and status, Celeste had been developing expertise that was valued by people whose opinions carried real weight in fields that mattered. The most painful aspect of these realizations was understanding how her treatment of Celeste had been not just wrong, but actively harmful. She had spent years treating her sister as someone who needed guidance and correction, someone whose choices and priorities were somehow deficient. But now she understood that Celeste had been operating at levels of achievement and responsibility that Melody hadn't even known existed, that her quiet confidence and independence had been grounded in accomplishments that far exceeded anything in her experience. When the party finally began to wind down and people started making their departure preparations, Melody found herself facing the prospect of a car ride home with Celeste, a conversation that would be unlike any they had ever had. The easy condescension that had characterized their previous interactions was no longer possible. The assumption of superiority that had guided Melody's approach to their relationship had been completely undermined by the evening's revelations. As they walked toward the parking garage together, Melody struggled to find words that could bridge the gap between her previous understanding and her new awareness of who Celeste actually was. The silence between them felt heavy with unspoken recognition of how thoroughly their relationship would need to be reimagined in light of what had been revealed. "Celeste," Melody said as they reached her car, her voice tentative and uncertain in a way that was completely foreign to her usual confident manner. "I need to apologize. I realize now that I've never really understood what you do, what your work actually involves." Celeste's response was gentle, but measured, the careful diplomacy of someone who had learned to navigate delicate interpersonal situations with the same precision she brought to medical procedures. "You don't need to apologize, Melody. My work requires a certain level of discretion, and I've gotten used to people not understanding the full scope of what I do." But Melody knew that this wasn't really about discretion or classified information. This was about her own failure to show curiosity about her sister's life, her own inability to see beyond her limited definitions of what constituted meaningful work. The military aspects of Celeste's career might have been classified, but her medical expertise, her research contributions, her commitment to serving others, all of that had been visible to anyone who cared to look.
I made assumptions about your work that were completely wrong. And I'm realizing now that I never even tried to understand what was actually important to you. The conversation continued as they drove through the quiet city streets, with Melody asking questions she should have asked years ago, showing interest in aspects of Celeste's work that she had previously dismissed or ignored. For the first time in their adult relationship, Melody was listening to learn rather than listening to respond, seeking to understand rather than seeking to advise or correct. As Celeste described some of the medical research she had been involved in, the innovations she had contributed to, the recognition she had received from medical organizations, both military and civilian, Melody began to appreciate not just the scope of her sister's achievements, but also the depth of her commitment to work that transcended personal advancement. This wasn't someone who had stumbled into success or who had been fortunate in their career path. This was someone who had deliberately chosen work that involved sacrifice and risk, who had dedicated her professional life to serving others in ways that required extraordinary skill and courage. The most profound shift for Melody was understanding that Celeste's quiet manner, her reluctance to discuss her work in detail, her apparent indifference to traditional markers of success, all of these qualities that Melody had interpreted as weaknesses were actually expressions of strength and confidence. Celeste didn't need external validation because she had found validation in the work itself, in the knowledge that her efforts were making a measurable difference in areas that truly mattered. By the time they reached Celeste's hotel, Melody had begun to understand that rebuilding their relationship would require more than just acknowledging her mistakes. It would require fundamentally reimagining how she thought about success, achievement, and what constituted a life well lived. The values that had guided her own career choices, the priorities that had shaped her understanding of what mattered, all of that would need to be examined and possibly restructured in light of what she had learned about the kind of impact that was possible when someone dedicated their life to serving something larger than themselves. The conversation didn't end with easy resolution or simple apology. The damage done by years of misunderstanding and condescension couldn't be repaired in a single evening. But it ended with something perhaps more valuable, a genuine recognition of the work that would be required to build a relationship based on mutual respect rather than assumed superiority. As Melody drove home through the empty streets, she found herself thinking about the choices that had led her to this moment, the values that had guided her career decisions, the definitions of success that had shaped her understanding of what constituted a meaningful life. The evening had been more than just a revelation about her sister's hidden accomplishments. It had been a confrontation with her own limitations, her own shallow understanding of what truly mattered in the world. The woman she had dismissed as unsuccessful had been saving lives while Melody was focused on profit margins. The sister she had tried to help and improve had been operating at levels of achievement that made Melody's accomplishments seem trivial by comparison. The quiet, unassuming person she had pitied and condescended to had been earning recognition from some of the most distinguished leaders in fields that affected human welfare and survival. Over the following weeks, as Melody processed the implications of what she had learned, she began to make changes in her own life that reflected a new understanding of what constituted meaningful work. She started volunteering at a veterans organization, not to assuage her guilt, but to better understand the world her sister served. She began reading about military medicine and trauma care, trying to educate herself about fields she had previously ignored. She changed how she talked about success and achievement, becoming more curious about the substance of people's work rather than just their titles and salaries. Most importantly, she began building a new relationship with Celeste, one based on genuine respect and curiosity rather than assumed superiority.
The conversations they had were different now, grounded in Melody's recognition that she had much to learn from someone whose life had been dedicated to service and innovation in ways that truly mattered. The Christmas party at Sterling and Associates had been intended as a showcase for Melody's professional success and social connections. Instead, it had become a profound education in the difference between achievement that serves the self and achievement that serves others, between success that impresses peers and success that saves lives, between work that advances careers and work that advances human knowledge and capability. The evening had ended with Melody's worldview fundamentally altered, her understanding of her sister completely transformed, and her own priorities permanently shifted toward values that transcended personal advancement. The woman she had called a nobody had revealed herself to be someone whose work mattered in ways Melody was only beginning to understand. The sister she had tried to help had shown her what genuine service and dedication looked like. The quiet, unassuming person she had dismissed had demonstrated the kind of impact that was possible when someone committed their professional life to serving something larger than themselves. In years later, when Melody was asked to describe the most important moment in her adult life, she would return to that Christmas party, to the moment when her understanding of everything she thought she knew about success and achievement had been completely overturned. It had been painful and humbling, but it had also been transformative, opening her eyes to possibilities for meaningful work and genuine contribution that she had never previously considered. The woman she had called a nobody had taught her what it meant to be somebody in ways that truly mattered. The sister she had tried to fix had shown her what was broken in her own understanding of what constituted a life well lived. The quiet, unassuming person she had dismissed had demonstrated the kind of impact that was possible when someone committed their professional life to serving something larger than themselves.